Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop f1 to c4. Knight g8 to f6. Knight f3 to g5. Pawn d7 to d5. Pawn e4 takes d5. Knight c6 to a5. Bishop c4 to b5, check. Pawn c7 to c6. Pawn d5 takes c6. Pawn b7 takes c6. Bishop b5 to e2. Pawn h7 to h6. Knight g5 to f3. Pawn e5 to e4. Knight f3 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Pawn f2 to f4. Queen d8 to h4, check. Pawn g2 to g3. Queen h4 to d8. Castle kingside. Bishop f8 to c5, check. Pawn d2 to d4. Knight d7 takes e5. Pawn d4 takes c5. Queen d8 takes d1. Rook f1 takes d1. Bishop c8 to g4. Knight b1 to c3. Knight e5 to f3, check. King g1 to h1. Pawn f7 to f5. Bishop c1 to e3. Pawn g7 to g5. Pawn b2 to b4. Knight a5 to b7. Bishop e2 to c4. Pawn a7 to a5. Pawn b4 takes a5. Knight b7 takes a5. Bishop c4 to e6. King e8 to e7. Rook d1 to d6. King e7 to e8. Knight c3 takes e4. Pawn g5 takes f4. Knight e4 to f6, check. King e8 to e7. Bishop e3 to d4. Knight f3 takes d4. Rook d6 takes d4. Bishop g4 to f3, check. King h1 to g1. King e7 takes e6. Rook d4 takes f4. Bishop f3 to e2. Rook a1 to e1. Knight a5 to c4. Rook e1 takes e2, check. Knight c4 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. King e6 takes d7. Rook e2 takes e5. Rook a8 takes a2. Rook f4 to d4, check. King d7 to c7. Rook e5 to e7, check. King c7 to c8. Rook d4 to d6. Rook a2 to a1, check. King g1 to f2. Rook a1 to a6. Rook e7 to e6. Rook h8 to d8. Rook e6 takes h6. King c8 to c7. Rook h6 to h7, check. King c7 to c8. Rook h7 to f7. Pawn f5 to f4. Pawn g3 to g4. Pawn f4 to f3. King f2 takes f3. Rook a6 to a3, check. King f3 to e4. Rook a3 to a4, check. King e4 to f3. Rook d8 to h8. Rook d6 takes c6, check. King c8 to d8. Rook c6 to d6, check. King d8 to c8. Rook d6 to d2. Rook h8 to h3, check. King f3 to g2. Rook h3 to c3. Rook f7 to f8, check. King c8 to b7. Rook d2 to d7, check. King b7 to c6. Rook f8 to f3. Rook a4 takes g4, check. Rook f3 to g3. Rook c3 takes c2, check. King g2 to f3. Rook g4 takes g3, check. Pawn h2 takes g3. King c6 takes d7. Pawn g3 to g4. King d7 to c6. Pawn g4 to g5. King c6 takes c5. King f3 to e4. Rook c2 to e2, check. King e4 to d3. Rook e2 to g2. King d3 to e4. Rook g2 takes g5. King e4 to f3. King c5 to d4. King f3 to f4. Rook g5 to g2. King f4 to f3. Rook g2 to d2. King f3 to f4. Rook d2 to f2, check. King f4 to g3. King d4 to e3. King g3 to g4. King e3 to d4. King g4 to g3. King d4 to e3. King g3 to g4. King e3 to e4. King g4 to g3. Rook f2 to e2. King g3 to g4. Rook e2 to g2, check. King g4 to h4. King e4 to d4. King h4 to h5. King d4 to e4. King h5 to h4. King e4 to d4. King h4 to h5. King d4 to e4. King h5 to h4. The game is a draw.